Fantastic. Well, we've just ticked over to 5:35, so I will officially get things underway, and there'll be some people that join us as we get started. It's my pleasure as your Queensland State President to welcome you to the Keeble Lecture for 2021. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Shannon, and thank you so much for joining us this evening for what I'm confident will be a thought-provoking presentation from our guest, Professor Ed Blakely. I'm joining the session today from the country of the Turrbal and Yagara people, and I'd like to extend my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and thank them for their custodianship of this land. We also have people joining us for this session from across Queensland and also interstate, so I would like to extend that acknowledgement and thanks to the First Nations people across Australia. As I said, it's a pleasure to see so many of us joining from across Queensland and interstate tonight. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank you for joining us, but also acknowledge our Life Fellows and Fellows of the Institute who are joining us tonight, as well, of course, as our members and our friends. The Keeble Lecture is held every year by PIA Queensland in honour of Lewis Bingham Keeble, the Foundation Professor of Regional and Town Planning at the University of Queensland. And before I introduce our guests for this evening, I would like to invite John Brennick, a Life Fellow of our Institute and someone who was taught by Professor Keeble, to share a couple of anecdotes. John, if you'd take it away, please.
Thanks, Shannon. It's a pleasure to talk about Lewis in a more casual way, because what you don't see in the official bios of Lewis Keeble is that he was a great teacher, and he was. So I've in my cohort, which was in the early 1970s, there was only 15 of us. We did his master's degree course in planning. We seemed to agree on this particular first session that we had with Lewis Keeble. It's a short anecdote, and
Oh, I think we've lost John there. Gemma, have we definitely lost John? Well, that is unfortunate.
Yes, I think his internet may, yeah.
All right,
yeah, his
sorry,
internet
everyone.
probably cut off.
Thanks, Gemma. Sorry, everyone, that's an unfortunate thing to have happened, because John was literally just about to share with us a really nice anecdote about Professor Keeble. I won't try and replicate that. We wanted John to do it as someone who was taught by Professor Keeble, but the reason we did want John to share that was just to make sure that people, particularly the newer generation of planners, have an understanding of why this lecture is held each year and who it's in honour of. But in light of John's potential internet troubles, we'll keep moving. And if he joins us later on, we can do that anecdote later. So thank you, John, for almost getting us there. The 2021 Keeble Lecture tonight will be delivered by Professor Ed Blakely, and it's on the topic of the post-COVID city, recover or reposition. Now, for those of us who are just still joining us, I would like to ask a couple of things. Firstly, while Professor Blakely is presenting, can I ask that you mute yourself and, if possible, have your video off as well, just so we can very much focus on our main guest. If you do have questions throughout the session, we'll be holding a Q&A at the end, and I'm sure it will be a robust one. Can I ask that you capture your questions in the chat? Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Zoom, if you hover your cursor around the bottom of your screen, you'll see a ribbon come up, and it's the speech bubble. That is the chat box. Hit on that and type your question in. I'll be monitoring that chat, and we will come back to those questions in the Q&A session at the end. And I've just seen John's back, so we might, sorry, Professor Blakely, we'll go back to John and just get him to finish his anecdote. Thanks, John.
Sorry, Shannon, I don't know what happened there. One of those COVID things, that's what I'm blaming anyway. Look, there were 15 of us in the master's course. We were waiting for the legend, Lewis Keeble, who wrote The Principles and Practice of Town and Country Planning. Our first leg, it was a hot day in the early 70s, and they were in a demountable near the architecture and planning building. And in walks this magnificent person who lived up to the sort of things we'd read about him. And he had 15 paper cups with him. And he put down one in front of each of us and introduced himself in this very English, it seemed a bit West End type London accent. And he then turned around and out of his bag pulled out half of a flagon of red wine. Now, here's the legend. The first time we met him, and we're all there, 15 out of 15 of us, and he started to pour the rest of the half flagon of red wine, which we call claret in those days, into into these plastic, into these paper cups. Anyway, he said, all right, na zdrowie, and which is, close to the Polish term for down the hatch. Well, it was putrid. It was absolutely awful, but because we revered him, and I wasn't really drinking much at that stage, but I thought, well, I better have some. I was so awful. And he was that sort of person. He said, look, if you don't want to drink, you don't have to. It's okay. And then he just went on with his first lecture. I forget what it was all about. I was still trying to clean the stuff out of my mouth. But the second anecdote that really impressed all of us, or the few I've spoken to about the way that Lewis taught, we must have walked every street in St. Lucia to look at streetscape form, to look at the trees, to look at the pavement, but we'd always end up at his house and he'd have a full flagon of wine. Now, he didn't make us drink. We didn't have to. Our lectures were in 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Sometimes we didn't leave till 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And most of us were 25 years and older. And we often had partners and they hardly ever believed it. So we introduced him, our partners, to Lewis. And I must say, he had the greatest attendance rate of anybody. And yet most of us didn't like his claret. Anyway, that's something you don't read in the bios. We all thought that we should share that with you. I'm really looking forward to hearing Ed talk tonight.
Thank you so much for that, John. I am glad that we could hear that. It sounds like Lewis was very memorable, and hence why we're honouring him tonight with our Keeble lecture. But as you've mentioned, very excited to hear Professor Blakely speak as well. So Professor Blakely is the founder and principal of the city's Leadership Institute and is one of the world's leading scholars and practitioners of urban policy. Across his career in academia, he has been Dean of the School of Urban Planning and Development at the University of Southern California and Dean of the Robert J. Milano Graduate School of Management and Urban Policy at the New School University in New York City. He has also served as an honorary professor in urban policy at the University of Sydney. Professor Blakely came to Australia in 2003, serving as Professor of Urban Planning, and was also head of the reference committee for the Sydney Metropolitan Plan. In 2005, the US government asked Professor Blakely to return to the US and guide the recovery operations in New Orleans after the devastating Katrina floods. Professor Blakely has advised presidents of the United States on both sides of politics. President Clinton named Professor Blakely to serve on the Base Conversion Commission, and later President Clinton appointed Professor Blakely as Vice Chair of the Presidio Trust. And the Presidio is one of the most challenging military installations to be transformed into functioning public space due to its historic assets, but also its elegant San Francisco Bay location. Professor Blakely has served as a national advisor on urban planning, innovation and development for the World Bank, the OECD, and as chair of the Sydney Metropolitan Plan in 2003. Professor Blakely is a permanent visiting professor at the University of Venice in climate change and disaster recovery. For his advice on pre- and post-disaster planning and reconstruction for the European Commission, he was awarded the 2018 Citation for European Municipal Democracy. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to the Professor.
Well, thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen now and begin our conversation. I forgot to bring my wine. But I think my wine's probably better than Professor Keeble's. Thank all of you for being here this evening and taking the time to listen to me. I actually have points of origin in Australia that go back to the 70s when Professor Keeble was at Queensland University. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but I think it's important for you all to know that the reason I came here and stayed here is due to a very good friend and mentor of mine, Bob Stimson. Bob actually developed the Southeast Queensland Metropolitan Strategy, which still goes, and I hope Bob is still going. I haven't been in touch with him in a little while, but Bob is certainly one of the princes of our profession and a person that's transformed it, not just in Australia, but around the world. And thank you, John and Shannon, for hosting this and giving me the opportunity to talk about something that's near and dear to me. You can imagine a person like myself who's been involved in disasters around the world recently, particularly in the 90s, in the 2000s. COVID, I equate to another kind of disaster. And from this disaster, we have some options. And my theme in this talk is don't rebuild, don't go back, but move forward from the disaster and reposition yourself. So that is my central theme, and that is the theme that I'm going to use this evening in our talk. So we as planners have opportunities almost no one else has. People listen to us when we dream, when we think big thoughts, and we're capable of transforming those big thoughts into very big actions. But those actions have to come from someplace. We can't wait. We can't wait on a storm or a disaster. We really have to plan for, with climate change coming, for what's going to come next. And COVID, like Katrina, is a little tickler, giving us some evidence that things are changing and changing very fast. COVID has been one of those events for us that, like so many in Australia, it hadn't hit us very hard or very deeply. But when it did hit us, particularly recently, we found ourselves not as well prepared as we thought we were. But all over the world, the Delta variant has really wreaked havoc and still is wreaking havoc, even in Europe today. So people, even when they know something is happening, are sometimes slow to act. And that means government has the responsibility of helping them act in the right ways. But government today is in a very deep crisis. In my homeland, my fatherland, government is in a steep, deep crisis because the very foundations have been shaken. And even here in Australia, in the recovery from COVID, we found different states, Queensland, South Australia, West Australia, acting as though they didn't have confidence in the central government. When the central government did act, sometimes it acted very clumsily, like in the distribution of the right drugs at the right time, and those vaccines not coming, we lost a bit of confidence. Some governments were really very truculent. They said, do this. In China, 57 million people in Hubei were locked in their residencies for more than 2 months, not being able to go out, not being able to do anything, not being able to communicate, only to get foods. New York Times said a shutdown like that would almost certainly lead to a human rights violation in most of the rest of the world. And the shutdowns we had here, people are still demonstrating about as human rights violations. And in many places, like the United States, people think they're patently unconstitutional. So when government is afraid, what it tends to be is a bit timid. It tends to step back rather than lead. And we now have to stop being police and start leading, because government is not able to say for sure how this course of the pandemic is going to work out, what actions you can take that are actually going to preserve your livelihood, improve your community, and even save your loved ones. So when government's in crisis, it is sometimes either very tyrannical, as it's being accused of in some places in this country, or very timid, as we've seen more recently in Germany. When you haven't done the right thing early on, you have to be even more tyrannical later on. And Germany and Austria are seeing that now. Some places that thought they really had it going well, like Singapore and Taiwan, have to revisit where they were. So that makes people really shaky about whether government knows what it's doing. So when government doesn't know what it's doing, who does? And let me just say to you, I was in this situation in Katrina, where people had lost a great deal of faith in government because the instrumentality, the barriers that were put up, failed. And their failure were a metaphor for people of the failures in the entire system. The city was deeply segregated and separated. People wanted to make a new and better place. And my first reaction was to say, how do we get back to where we are? But I was quickly chastised by a colleague of mine in the profession who said, going back is not a strategy. What you have to do is move to a different place and deal with all the issues. Don't let a disaster go to waste. Take advantage of it to reposition. And he gave me a couple of good examples, like Kobe, in Japan, which was one of the leading ports in the world, the movement of automobiles and steel. And it was hit by an earthquake and a fire. And by the time they even set up again and got ready to do business, other ports had taken over their business. So they could not go back to where they were. The same was true in New Orleans. Going back was impossible because people knew we weren't there, so they couldn't come for holidays and vacations, the thing we offered, tourism. So we had to rethink who we were and where we're going to go. That means a long foresight, not just looking out 5 or 10 years, but looking out 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And to look out that far, you have to have a strategy that is genuinely telescopic, that takes you well into the future. Churchill said, when thinking about experts and his generals, he said, the generals are always prepared for the last war and never prepared for the one we're in or the next one. We have to be prepared for the next war, because COVID is a double wake-up call for us. Just last week, there was an agreement to reduce and phase out coal, which is one of the supporting mechanisms for our economy. Also, we found that people are voting with their feet. The urban structures we have built are being thought about. People are moving with their feet to other locations. So we have to think about, where can we be? Where should we be? So the first thing I want to say is that, believe it or not, luck is not a strategy. Even though we're the lucky country, Donald Horn meant lucky country in the worst, most cynical way. He said, in our climb to being one of the most powerful countries in the world, we're really second-rate bureaucrats, lacking political and economic smarts, and lacking innovation and ambition. So he had a very different notion of luck. So let's not lean back and hope that luck will get us out of climate change. Luck will help us recover from COVID, and luck will build the industries, the talent that we need to be a competitive nation. So without luck, we have to look around the world to see how we craft a strategy. And that strategy has to be an essential, a deep part of the public psyche. Now, I think about this from my point of origin, which is vastly different, the United States, and we won't go into how my people came there. Some of them were already there. I'm part Native American, and some were brought by sea. But they all, very early on, started moving westward, starting encountering the plains. And when the first governments in the United States were put together, they did the same thing. They didn't think huddling on the shore of the first arrival point on the East Coast was the best strategy. We need a bigger, deeper, wider, and smarter approach. My first visit here was in the Gulf Whitlam era, when we here in Australia were thinking about the same thing. We called it decentralization. But decentralization and model cities and those strategies would make, based on the notion of the green city and the like, were fanciful notions, but they didn't have the deep-seated concept of how you build these structures to last. And that's what we have to do now. Not just grab an idea off the shelf or something from somebody else. We have to have a purposeful settlement pattern, a pattern that is not built on the old, that we're still fighting about, but one that reforms place, that makes new places. And you notice in this slide, people are out of doors for dining and not indoors. We may have more people eating in different ways and different structures than we had in the past, and we shouldn't back into that. We should do it purposefully. And a settlement strategy for us means we have to find a way off the coast, not just where we are, but where we have to be and must be. So where's work going to be? Who's going to be doing it? How are they going to be doing? So it has to be a very purposeful strategy. We know from history that these strategies require an understanding of what's coming. And we know that cloud storage, new technologies are coming. And rather than just settle back and see how they're going to move us, we've got to move with them and beyond them and take advantage of them. We have to have a strategy that moves or uses artificial intelligence and new robots and things like this to move away from jobs of the hands to jobs of the heads. And those jobs are all being done around the world in good places. They're not muddy, ugly holes that much of our industrial space was in. They're not caves or mines, but they're great places to live and work. So luck will not get us there. That is not a strategy. We can't roll the dice and hope for the best. What do? Well, I think we have to have a national strategy, and I believe the PIA is saying we need a national settlement strategy. What would be the first element of that national settlement strategy? Well, the first element would be to do what I call deconcentration, moving away from everything centering on the major city, the Brisbane, the Perth, Melbourne, Sydney, and having a complex networks of relatively equal size cities. Certainly there will be a Melbourne and a Perth and so forth, but these places are going to carry the loads they should in administration and in finance and the like. But there can be other cities that have strong capacity. The decentralization notion lacked city building as its base. It was just going to move people from one place to another. But the new strategy has to be building purposeful regional locations that have everything in them that will allow them to compete in the future, like the Southeast Queensland strategy. And coupled with the Southeast strategy is the city deal, making cities having equal capacity to command the opportunities to live, to work in one place, but take advantage of the entire region in the world. So we need to build on regions, competitive regions, as the first strategy. So maybe we take a lesson from my home country and move our state legislative centers out of the congested big cities. I think a great new capital of Queensland would be Toowoomba, and all those Toowoomba can clap now. Just the thought of moving there, moving the legislators to a different place as we move to Canberra, loosens the mind and gives you new options and opportunities. And it is not hard to make such a move. We're moving most of our administration here in Sydney to Parramatta, and there won't be a miss of a beat. And if we move the state capital to Orange or Bathurst, I don't think there'd be a miss of a beat at all. But what would that do? It would flatten the housing curve, because people would be moving out rather than moving in. And legislators would be thinking about how to deconcentrate. Look at the United States. Until 1960, there are 3 cities over 1 million in the United States. The spreading of wealth, the decoupling of wealth from place is something that we have to do. Now, I know there are other global wealth conversations and the like going on, but until we can spread our population and harness the strengths of what we have inland, we can't make it. In the US, in this new Biden bill, there's a very strong concentration on rail. And rails will join Detroit, Chicago, and St. Louis, not just rails that join New York with Boston. So the notion here, and the central notion, is to deconcentrate. And when we deconcentrate, we have to make the places to which we deconcentrate strong in themselves. And there are 3 things they have to have. One of them is a human resources-led capacity, research and learning. One of the things I learned when I was working here in the decentralization schemes, and when I was in Albury-Wodonga, I said over and over, the very first thing we need here is a new university that can build on what we have here build on science, on the wine and all the industries we have here, and make a new science, a competitive science, and that will build and keep people there. So we have to have resource regionally led strategies that have at their core strong institutional foundations in the arts, in education and life. While there's depopulation going in a lot of rural places in the United States, the places that have universities are remaining strong and good places to live and work. Work can get to those places and it sticks there. So we have to have digital capacity, and I'll go into that more later, a rail spine and internal connectivity if we're going to compete with the rest of the world, globally and locally. It doesn't matter whether you're in a coffee shop in Bondi or the middle of Alice Springs, you have the same exact capacity on the internet. And that internet should build places and strengthen that capacity and capability, not ciphered off to the bigger cities, but build stronger locally places. And we see with pandemics, the lack of hospitals, the lack of things in those communities makes them difficult to serve and makes people not want to live there. So to build the future, we have to build strong regions and sub-regional locations. And we have to do it for quite another reason. The congestion that we have in our cities is a huge burden. Billions of dollars is spent every year sitting in traffic jams. We need to build cities and places where there's easier, smoother, better movement. People are complaining about oil prices and the like when they could be riding their bikes, when they could be using shorter distances to closer outlets. I don't want to work from home, but I want to work near home. And that's what we have to build. Build new places that are strong enough to contain and build our citizens, make them able to compete globally and locally, and invent new products, goods, and services. It is the producer services are the sectors of the future, not the mining, not the old industrial types. The future is coming out of our heads and not our hands. So that future means we start building innovation into every one of our communities. That investment is being thought of now. That don't try to make the community a great place by just cleaning it up, making Main Street better, or putting a major supermarket in it. Start thinking about putting an innovation center there based on the local human talent and the natural resources. So we have to make place and space much stronger and more equal. And the spine of this has to be step 3. You've heard a lot about high-speed rail, and some people say it's too expensive. I'd say it's too expensive not to do it. If we look at countries that have adopted high-speed rail in the last 20 years, like Spain, China, it's transformed their GDP. Spain was an agricultural country, not even competitive, worried about what they would do with 20 and 30% unemployment. When they added high-speed rail in Barcelona and Madrid and the cities around them, all of a sudden they become an engineering powerhouse. And the train systems we're building here in Sydney come from Spain. And much of the product and services that are made in China, the logistics chain has been transformed because of the speed of delivery. Speed makes a difference, not just speed to take people from place to place, but to take goods from place to place, as Japan shows. So we need a backbone of high-speed rail, but that backbone has to be serviced by fast rail. That is, within 90 minutes, you can get to the high-speed rail, which gets you to almost any place else in 90 minutes or less. So coupling these systems of rail, and that's what's going to be done in the Northeast corridor in the United States, will be transformative. Cities that are dying or dead are already looking to rekindling themselves because they have a local university or a college, they have good living spaces, and with good connections to the major cities, they can now, and with the internet, they can now compete. Without those connections, without being able to, the cultural connections and the science connections and those other connections, it's not possible. And now if I were going to build this high-speed rail, and I've been a consultant to it, one of the things I do is make sure that high-speed rail touched every one of our airports, including the new one in Western Sydney and in Canberra and Melbourne, so that we build a system where air, rail, and road intersect. It means the best doctor, the best science can be almost any place in under 2 hours. And we have that capacity along with all that connectivity. Each of our places can have a strategy that competes globally as the cities I mentioned here. But they can't do that looking backward. They have to look forward. What innovations in your space and in your place will make you and your place competitive in the future? We've had tremendous breakthroughs here in Australia. The rapid testing devices that's being used all over the world came from Queensland, but we're the last ones to adopt it here. Many of the technologies used around the world came from Australia, but we're the last ones to adopt them here. We have to start thinking space, science, capacity in order to reach greatness. And that means people and places, not just raw materials. So telemobility is going to be very important. Almost all of us are going to our doctor online now for consultation. But those consultations can also begin building social capital with communities and residents, Aboriginal communities and the like, don't have to be in the back end of science. They can use their own knowledge and so forth to develop new sciences and new capacities. And tomorrow I'll be doing that with an Aboriginal group. We can make the infrastructure of the past and the social commitments of the past build great futures. But that requires new governance frameworks like Southeast Queensland, where governments work together to transform places and spaces and not compete with one another internally. So building that competitiveness means the mayors and others coming together, as you see here in this picture, working together, Liverpool, Parramatta, all of them working together to build the West, not separately, but together. And that's what the city deal is all about. The other factor that I think most of you are already very well aware of is that our people, since COVID and even before COVID, most of the workers in this country are in the service sector. But we have working practices and working rules from Henry Ford that says you start at 8 and you stop at 5. Why? There is no reason for that. You start on Monday, you stop on Friday. Why? And why are we using 5 days? There's no reason for that. We need to really relook at, as a national strategy, a national approach, moving to the 4-day week to release the potential of people to commit themselves to building their intellectual capital. If we can do that, we can do almost anything. So we cut down the travel time, the work travel. We spend more time traveling than we do working. Then release the potential of full families to be good, strong families in their location. But the location in the middle of the city may not be the one they prefer. And people are already voting with their feet and moving to non-metropolitan communities. And they can work from there. And we're going to see more of that. Let's not run away from it. Let's endorse it. Let's make it part of our national strategy. And the 4-day week will allow us to do many more things that we haven't been able to do in the past. So it's not working from home, it's working near home, it's working in purposely built communities that merge work and home life, not that segregate them. When I was sitting as a commissioner, acting commissioner, I was looking at homes being built, and we said, well, we can't have any work here, or the work has to be someplace else. But all of a sudden, we're taking work into the home. Why don't we start building communities that have places of work nearby, clustered in the building of the community? So to do that, we have to have a really deep connectivity. I have the NBN, and my wife has given a different name because it's on and off so much. It's no ban never in her vocabulary. We have to have a deep, deep commitment to having deep connectivity with a national system. We started out in that way and we lost our way. And now we have a second-rate system when we have to have a first-rate system. So that people, and they move into regional communities, they are not disenfranchised. They've got the internet right at their doorstep. And that has to be a national commitment. And it probably won't take very much to connect this law and make it right. And these new workspaces have to be multifunctional, and they need to be designed. We can't wait for the next developer to think of what needs to be there. We as planners have to think about clearly how we design spaces for the future, where working and living are joined in the same buildings next door and the like. So that network of roads is reduced. The high rises that take the skyline in destructive directions are abandoned to closer, smaller, more robust, more interesting communities. And this is the next thing we have to do. Point number 6, we have to craft communities, build precincts, not house by house, not building by building, but really thought through precincts in our new spaces. And those precincts have to be crafted. So we use energy better, we use water better, but we also use people better. And we've been talking about the 30-minute city. In Paris, they're about to figure out how to build a 10-minute city. And that should be our goal as well. Making cities within 10 minutes, you can do all the things that are essential. And 30 minutes out, you can do all the cultural and the social things. And if you get on that fast train, you may be able to get to some of the more outstanding things, the great opera, the great plays, and all that connected up in well-built, well-designed places. We are not yet doing that. But again, the planning profession here in New South Wales, and I know in Victoria, are committed to changing the planning codes that are precinct-based now and not just building-based. And we have to get away from our current zoning laws and make things more performance organized. So it's what you're going to perform. It's not how big it is, not how high it is, How does it come together and make a great place? That should be the aim of what we're trying to do. That should be the good wine in this program. So those 6 things are doable. And we can make spaces that are darn near COVID proof in doing that. Places that are interesting, high quality, and designed from the beginning, not an afterthought. So just to conclude, here's the new family. Here's how they're going to work in the future. They moved to Toowoomba. They remain connected, but it's a hassle. But with high-speed trains and fast trains, they can get around. On day 1 in their new community, where they both moved from Sydney on the North Shore where I live, they're now relaxed in Toowoomba, doing gardening in the morning. In the afternoon, they're in Sydney. On day 2, the whole family can enjoy working together, school in the home. Not the kind of school in the home that we've just been experiencing, but maybe in collective school in the home, a dance class in your house, a meeting in your community, using the internet to facilitate that. On day 3, the family can all go together from Toowoomba all the way to Melbourne, stop off to see Shakespeare in Newcastle, as one would, and get home for dinner. And on the 4th day, you go to your work centers. The kids go to their work centers, you go to your work centers. 5th day, you do your regional connections using easy movement systems, no cars involved. And on the 6th day, you go see your visitors from out of town, and you stop over in Orange overnight. But you haven't spent a single night, except for that one, in a bed in a hotel. All this can be done. Making quality communities, quality density, people near one another requires strategy, not luck. And we can do it here. It's not too expensive, and it is time to do it now. Let's connect ourselves up and make a better tomorrow. Our children deserve it, the world deserves it, and we can do it. Thank you.
Professor Blakely, thank you so much for that. I'm sure if we were in a room, we'd be getting a huge round of applause, but it's happening virtually, I'm sure of it. That was clearly thought-provoking because I have my work cut out for me. The comments section has been going off. There's been questions, discussion. So thank you to all the people who've been throwing ideas, thoughts and discussions in there. I will do my best to bring them together into a few questions to kick off the Q&A with the professor. So firstly, I'm going to draw a couple together. Linda, Illy and Vinit had, as well as Nancy, had a few that I'm going to join together and put to you. This idea of decentralisation has certainly got some discussion happening in the chat. In the Australian context, where we have challenges around things like access to water, that connection to the coast culturally as well, but also outside of our coastal area, a lot less anchoring infrastructure as well. How do you see it working? What do you think will be the nucleus of these new inland cities that we're going to relocate from the coast?
Well, the first thing I said, we were going to move our legislators. When they move, all of a sudden there's water, there's energy, there's all those things. Every capital of the United States is a great city. Sacramento, California, Albany, New York, and so on. Because people start concentrating and you bring science there. Good university, University of New York and Albany. So we have plenty of water if we use that comes from the sky in the right way, if we use that we get from the ground in the right way and the like. But we're gobbling it up, sending it to the cities, where if we spread our population, we wouldn't even need much of it. So I think everything I'm talking about, I'm not talking about going out in the desert and starting a new town. We've got great places like Albury and so forth we can build on now.
How do you think, noting that the US has a much larger population than Australia, with our lower population, how do you see this decentralisation happening? Do we have that population base to support it, Professor?
Yes, we're more densely settled in the United States, as you know.
Okay, cool.
So we certainly do. It's the density of the population, not the number, as Holland has shown.
Yeah.
So Holland has great quality places spread out across the country and very high density.
Fantastic. Well, you had a couple of people in the chat immediately agreeing with you there. A big thing that's happening at the moment up here in Southeast Queensland and in Brisbane is obviously the Olympics announcement. And we have had a question around how we can use that massive event that's coming to transform the city region in SEQ. So I guess in the context of what you're talking about in terms of moving us all to Toowoomba, which I'm sure anyone joining us from Toowoomba here tonight would be delighted to hear, what do you see that transformation as we head towards the Olympics looking like?
I think, and I gave a talk earlier this month to the mayors in Southeast Queensland, and basically said to them they ought to start thinking about having regionalize their infrastructure. Like the best opera house doesn't have to be in Brisbane. You know, we've got the beautiful Lockyer Valley. We've got all kinds of places where use the Olympics to trial those new things, to get some of the university activity outside the University of Queensland and the like into some of the other local places. But they can remain connected to the mother university with the internet. And that kind of thing can go on. And so the city deal is really important for SEQ. And I think that city deal is already aimed at doing many of those things. So you're on the road already.
You spoke a little bit about the importance of that digital infrastructure. Often when we talk about decentralisation, we largely focus on transport infrastructure, which feeds into your high-speed rail discussion as well. Which do you think needs to come first? If, you know, the realities of politics and funding, do we need to get the digital infrastructure right, or do we need to get our physical transport infrastructure happening first?
First, physical transport infrastructure, because as you're building the rail, you're also building the optic cable.
There we go. That's the solution. You have it. Someone has asked specifically about Adelaide and Perth not being on the east coast of Australia, if you think there's any different approach that would happen for those cities as they decentralise.
I think Perth actually is doing a pretty good job already, decentralizing and using the rail network built right next to the highway. So they are already on this path. And South Australia has been discussing this with the Overvan and all this kind of thing. So the discussions are actually in some ways more advanced in those places because they didn't have this rigid infrastructure to begin with. And I think those discussions are going quite well. The biggest problem we have there is we try, particularly in South Australia and Adelaide, we try to find a quick fix, a submarine, when the best fix would be the best university in the world.
You've spoken a bit about that science and innovation and education being real anchor projects. I guess do you consider that we're well placed for that? I know that Australia attracts a lot of people internationally to study out of universities. How are we placed internationally to really get to that top tier where that education, innovation and science is driving this agenda?
I talked to a Nobel Prize winner from the United States who's in Canberra, and he says the problem we have is that we send our best people overseas to be educated rather than keeping them here and bringing people here not for their money, but only the smartest people to be educated here and keeping them, like the University of California. When I was at the University of California, 85% of the students who attended the university stayed in the Bay Area.
Okay, so it's about attracting and keeping.
Attracting, keep. I hate to even talk about this, us keeping people out. All this debate about we're going to keep these people out of Australia. No, turn it around. All these smart people in Spain or India or Czechoslovakia, let's go recruit them.
I agree with you there, Professor. So I do have a question here from, sorry, I've lost it. No, there it is. You mentioned building innovation into communities. Can you expand on that and give us a bit more information on how we can do this?
Well, you're doing some of it in Queensland already. There's an innovation center that I've sent there that's very much built on the notion there's a lot of innovators around the community, and they've created facilities for them to come in and work and build new things and build new ideas with a little government support. Those innovation centers, I think, and I would have something, the government would give money to somebody like an innovation corporation that would help speed the notion of innovation coming into building. And when you're building buildings now, you have to have so much space for air and water and light and so much place for a gym. Why not have innovation space built into our new buildings and into our new communities? Innovation space should be planned in. That's why Silicon Valley is so far ahead. That's why Boston's so far ahead. The city is building those innovation centers, and then the people are coming in and taking them up, and nonprofits are running them. We can do that. And when I got there, the first one I went to in Boston, I walked in, and there are two young men from Australia who just won the innovation prize for Boston. Does that make any sense?
So in terms of actually building that into our communities, a lot of us work in the space strategically of crafting our planning schemes, which would be your local environmental plans down in New South Wales. We obviously need to factor it in there as well as when we're developing.
That's right. No, we should have that as an expectation.
Yeah,
as they do in Silicon Valley.
So can you talk a little bit more about Silicon Valley? What have they done that has made it so successful, and that we can relate to as planners?
A couple of things. One, a lot of the older space, and the one I worked on mostly is in Emeryville, which is near the University of California, Berkeley. Rather than trying to keep that as industrial, they've transformed it into craft space, and from craft space, it just grows, and now it's high-tech space. So they nurture, so rather than, tearing something down, they transform it, they let it evolve, they change the building code to meet the new expectations. And what we do is say, nope, you can't do that because code such and such doesn't allow it.
Okay, so a bit more flexibility and a bit more.
Not just more flexibility, but the planner should be thinking about the future, not the rule that's there. What can we, I had one embarrassing situation, I won't mention the city I was working in, where they wouldn't let a woman who was going to design new bridal wear come into an area because bridal shop was not mentioned in the planning code.
Yep. Those are the sort of stories we love hearing as planners. It makes us feel that big.
But so not only did she not move there, she moved out of the country, and now I have to buy her stuff.
Yeah. I'm going to change gears a little bit because I've seen a few more questions come through. And the first one is from Nicole about what you see happening with industrial developments and where they fit into your vision of decentralization.
Well, industrial development, if you mean industrial development like technology industrial development, that fits in very much. We ought to take care, and I'm working on a project now. We're going to take industrial space and make it into a high-tech space in the circular economy. So we know about, these are just words, but they're ways to take old factory buildings and start working with local entrepreneurs so they start recycling in those buildings rather than having the highest rent. run it. So we're gonna have low rent in those spaces, so that'll kindle building other things around it to develop. We tend not, and this is different for me, our planners are not thinking about how can we get something done, but how can we stop something from being done?
That's a good point. I think the question was very much in that pure industrial space. So the sort of uses that are generally people don't want near them, or are really heavy and have that high level of impact.
Well, one of the things we did at Emerald, we started recycling some of those places and invented some of the science that's being now used all over the world to clean up soils, clean up atmosphere, clean up space with some government grants and some university people. Let's think about how do we get something, how do we transform it into something better rather than stopping it from being something bad.
Okay, thanks. Again, changing gears. Vinit is wondering about your point on urban planning. I hope I've said that correctly. What do you mean with that? Is it that rural clusters become urbanized space?
Yes.
Brilliant. That is very definitive. Thank you, Professor. So I'm just going to head down as well. Mark has asked about how deconcentration can align with settlement strategies that include receiver cities for coastal climate change or bushfire refugees.
I don't really have an answer for that one, but I think Mark and I should work on it.
Mark, you know where to get in contact with Professor Blakely on that one. We also have one from Paul Burton. So, and he, I'll read it verbatim because he's incredibly eloquent. The pendulum of performance versus prescriptive planning regime never seems to be in the right place. And he'd personally really welcome the shifting of the focus of a performance-based regime to the precinct level rather than building form, setbacks and single-use zones. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and that's what it's at precinct level. Denver has, and for those of you who are interested, Denver has a great program where they say, here's the kind of outcomes we'd like in this neighborhood, and everyone comes together and they design these kinds of outcomes, and the developers come and compete to make them better. Rather than the developer reacting to the developer, the community say, here's the best outcome. How can you perform to meet that objective? What all of us hate, I hate in my neighborhood when somebody says, oh, we're going to build a 5-story or 10-story next door building next to you. If I had been in on the planning, I might have said, make it 20 stories.
Yes, I think you'd be against the tide on that one from generally what the sort of the pressures that we get.
Yeah, but you see what I'm saying? The people are against the surprise, not necessarily what would actually be there. And in Portland, Oregon, and I guess I haven't done it during COVID, every Saturday neighborhoods have charrettes to design what they want in the future of their neighborhood. So when a developer or builder comes in, he or she can go to the planning department and say, this is the preferred outcome for this lot.
How do you think
and there's
that works?
almost no deviation from that. The people like it. Yeah, I can make money on this.
Yeah, because you mentioned that it's the surprise that gets people concerned. How do we keep a system that allows for flexibility? Like our planning documents generally sit in place for over 5 years.
Yes.
In 5 years, a hell of a lot can change. So you want to build in flexibility to those plans, to those policies. How do we have that flexibility without then having that surprise element as well? What do you think's the solution?
I think what we have to do is set goals rather than trying to write prescriptions. We want a walkable community. I don't know all the ways you can do that, but somebody will come up with them.
Yeah. Do you agree? There's still that flexibility. We just need to deal with that surprise element better, perhaps.
Yeah. Now there's some surprises you don't want. Certainly, you don't want some overbuilt monstrosity in your neighborhood. Sometimes, I was quite surprised to learn that some things you can get without much hassle. You can put a church almost anywhere and a school. Why is that? Why not say, in this catchment, here are the locations we'd like to have schools.
That actually fits in quite nicely with another gem that Paul Burton's lobbed into the comments, which is a comment that he's made around an interesting suggestion he heard recently to auction development rights, perhaps within the framework of a precinct plan. What are your thoughts on that?
That's what New York does now.
Yeah. And you find it works well?
Yeah, in places they do it because it's pre-thought. Brooklyn's been totally transformed by that.
Fantastic. There we go, a gem from Paul. And I'm sorry, I've just missed one as well from Bennett, who's asking about climate change. He'd like to know what you think about planning which supports climate change transformations.
Well, we have to do that. And none of us know all the answers to this, but we know things that are pretty poor. For example, we've got to deal with these plastics and things that are hitting in our rivers. Right now, the plastic is from our face mask. You know, we've got to start thinking about more incentives to reuse closer to home, reuse centers and the like. Recycling and those things. I think the things that touch you are the things that make the difference, not things that are abstract ideas. I can still remember in the Second World War, the gardens we were making, and that still touches me. You know, I feel that the space isn't being used right because I actually learned how to make a garden at 5 years old. But now these things are esoteric. They're just too far away from us.
On that, we're coming close to the end of the Q&A session, and I'll take the liberty of asking a question that you said something at the start about needing that long foresight and really thinking into the future, which is really key and important. I find as planners, what we can probably struggle with is the political cycles and the time that are associated with them, and that task that we have to convince politicians who understandably want to be re-elected, so they're thinking that forward, how do we as a profession and individuals push towards that long foresight, that bold vision that might seem a little risky now but could pay off in 20 years' time? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we need to move to regional planning and local implementation.
Okay, that'll certainly get a few.
That's what Portland has done. So, so they have a regional plan, and then each community figures out how they fit into that regional plan and make great outcomes that'll benefit the entire city. If you go to one of these neighborhood charrettes, the people in the neighborhood are there, but 50% of people are from other neighborhoods because they know I might come to live here someday. And I know the purpose of your plan is to have so many seniors. I'm going to be a senior. I want to come here and help plan for that.
That's really interesting. And
so as planners, we should be doing more planning and less rulemaking, working with neighborhoods, communities, wherever you are, planning for their future. And that becomes part of the psyche. In the 8th grade in Chicago, which is a mess in many ways, the curriculum is about city planning. So downtown Chicago is fantastic, and many neighborhoods are very good. When I was in Oakland, California, we had an entire high school, and when I left New Orleans, an entire high school dedicated to urban planning and design. So that people learn about planning, not what to resist, but what to get.
I think that leaves us with a really powerful note to end the Q&A session on. I'm sorry, I think there was a couple of questions that might have come through at the end there, but that comment on more planning and less rulemaking. Thank you, Professor. I'd like for everyone to join me virtually in thanking Professor Ed Blakely for his very interesting and thought-provoking discussion. That is the most intense Q&A comment section that I've had to convene for a while. So thank you for bearing with me, everyone. Thank you, Professor. That was really wonderful. If there's a few things I'll take away is that task of decentralisation and how we can do it. And you said very much at the start of your presentation that need for us to move away from the coast, which will be a big task, particularly somewhere like Queensland, where we do have that very strong and very deep connection. So you've certainly given us some things to think about and some challenges. So thank you so much for your time. And it was our pleasure to host you as our 2021 Keeble lecturer. So if you want to join me, maybe you've got some people in the chat clapping, you can put your hand clap icon there just to let Professor Blakely know that his words and thoughts tonight were very well received. So thank you so much. We did promise to get you out of here at 6:45. We're right on the dot of that. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your time and your continued involvement and commitment to the Institute, and have a fantastic evening. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.